Live from Djerber, this is the Locktoon Podcast. I'm Amy.
And I'm Mel.
Today, I can finally say that we are rereading my absolute favorite book of all time, Harrow the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir. Today, we'll be covering the prologue all the way through chapter 5, and a huge amount of stuff happens in this first section. Also, on your first read, none of it would make sense at all. But the one thing that is very clear, even if everything is very confusing, is that Harrow is not okay.
Never a truer statement has been said.
Harrow is going through it.
Harrow's going through it, and you as a reader are also going through it, I'm sure. I remember what I was going through when I read this, and I was angry. I was confused. I was resentful.
Yeah. I think it took me like 2 tries to I was so mad about it.
Yep. So because we're in season 2 and we're reading Harrow, surprise, no bone jokes. I am moving on to a different type of joke.
Okay.
Which is a joke that, like, you would probably only understand if you've actually read the books. That's the path we're going down, because Harrow is the book that turned me into a big fan.
Yeah.
I loved Gideon, but this book, like, put me over the edge. And so these jokes are for you crazy fans of these books, where you make Harrow and Gideon jokes in your head or out loud, and no one else in your life has any idea what you're talking about. And so my question for you, Amy, is what does the second cohort have that Ianthe doesn't?
What?
Armies.
Oh, that's so silly. Nice one, Mel.
You're welcome, everyone.
Wow. Yep. All right. That's for all you fans out there. All the super fans. The Ianthe stans.
Let's get into it.
Let's freaking go. All right, let's start with the prologue. I will say that before anything, there is the dramatis personae again and a little poem. But honestly, I feel like they're not particularly important to cover right now. So we'll start with the prologue. It's really in media res. We are thrown right into the end of the book, basically, although you wouldn't know that the first time you read it. It also says there are a couple interesting things. A couple chapters in this book will say the night before the Emperor's murder, or like 14 months before the Emperor's murder. So everything in this book is kind of in timeline-wise in reference to the Emperor's murder. It also jumps back and forth between second person and third person.
Brilliant.
I know. The structure is incredibly good. I also just want to point out one little thing. The little decals, the pictures at the beginning of each chapter are kind of clues as well. So oftentimes the third person Canaan House Redux chapters are a fractured ninth house skull. And often a chapter that will focus really heavily on Ianthe will have a third house skull. So keep an eye out for those. I don't think I noticed them at all on my first read, but they are a little bit of a clue.
I did not catch that until this exact moment.
Yeah, this one starts with a little decal, I think, of one of the heralds. So I don't even know what I thought when I read this first bit, but it's complete chaos. We are basically thrown into the moment of time right before the climax of this book. The heralds of a resurrection beast, this is all new vocab for the first time you read this book. The heralds of the resurrection beast are trying to breach the Mithraeum, and we get a couple bits of info. God is on the loudspeaker. Everyone's in their own room. And God wants to keep Harrow safe, but Harrow sort of stubbornly responds that she doesn't need his help and that she doesn't think that she's going to die. And then we have Ianthe show up.
And this is a shock to the first time reader, because you don't see a lot of Ianthe in the first book, and then all of a sudden she is the second character that pops into this book right off the bat, and it is quite jarring.
Yeah, and we've read the first book, and we didn't really see anything from Harrow's perspective. And the first shot we see of Harrow is Harrow basically weak and not all powerful and super vulnerable. So it is a bit of a shock. We also don't have any context for the Ianthe-Harrow relationship. So this sort of B-list character shows up and is presented as a main character. So this is the first time we really see Ianthe as a main character. Ianthe is coming to Harrow and begging her to live and offering her protection. And Harrow basically refuses in a very funny way by saying all the things that she would rather do than accept help from Ianthe.
Yes.
And we do get a meme. We get meme number 1, I think.
We do get meme number 1. And right before that, something we should know is kind of this begging that Ianthe does to save Harrow. She says, turn around. I know what you've done, and I know how easy it is to reverse it. I mean, no idea. We have no idea what this means. And now we very much know what it means. But at the time we didn't. And so this is just a super confusing conversation that they're having.
I'm also interested in this. I don't know if this is figurative or literal language. It comes up many times. You are walking down a long corridor. You need to turn around. I am not really sure. I'm not really sure if this is a literal thing that is happening in the river or if it's kind of a figurative, you're walking away from the problem.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. So if anyone has any ideas around that particular line, but it does come up several times throughout this book. I kind of interpreted it as more metaphorical in that the old Harrow is kind of lost in her mind. And what Ianthe can do is bring her back and complete the literal process, help Harrow complete the literal process, or risk losing that Harrow.
Right.
But who knows? Maybe it is more literal and someone else has a really great read on that. But Harrow basically tells Ianthe to fuck off. And
yeah.
and Ianthe's response is, or I think Harrow says, go fuck yourself. And Ianthe's like, oh, I didn't know that we were talking dirty to each other, but I can roll with it. Choke me, daddy. Which, when I first read this, I actually didn't know this was a meme, but there's a great blog, which we can link in the description, that someone put together where they just outline all the memes in Harrow and different references. It's incredible, and we're not going to cite all of them, but this one was particularly fun, and it comes from this photo of Obama and Biden where Obama is putting a medal around Biden's neck, and the meme is Biden saying, choke me, daddy, to Obama. So just great, hilarious reference. And then, of course, a cute, stupid retort that Harrow makes is, well, your eyes don't match your face.
Which she says pretty often.
Yeah, there's a lot of references to Ianthe's eyes, and this is obviously significant because Ianthe forced Nibirius to become, or, she killed Nibirius against his will to become a lictor. And so there's a lot of shit going on with Ianthe's eyes.
Right.
And then there's like another meme that happens right away. The first 5 chapters are just filled with them. And this next meme is also a really good one where, Ianthe's like, fine, like, you don't want me to help you? I tried, and therefore no one should criticize me. And this actually references an SNL skit that Daniel Radcliffe was in. And I won't go into it, but it's funny. I rewatched it. It's like pretty old at this point. All of these memes are old.
Yes. I knew that meme, though. I did know that meme when I read the book.
I didn't. I did not. But after this, Harrow says a prayer. She tries to go under, and by under, we mean into the river. She doesn't succeed, is forced back out, comes awake, and actually has a sword sticking out of her stomach.
Her own rapier.
Her own rapier, which is shocking. And there's a really kind of subtle clue here where Tamsyn writes 5 pairs of eyes closed and only yours would not open again. Except that we know Harrow's eyes are open because she's awake and realizes that she's been stabbed. So someone's eyes have opened in Harrow here, but we don't know at this point who it is.
Right. And it does say at the very end, before passing out, Harrow utters 3 syllables, and they were 3 syllables that you didn't even understand. And we know now that those 3 syllables are Gideon, because basically, I mean, we've all read this book before. Gideon is narrating all of this, more or less. But Harrow has lobotomized her brain in order to remove the memory of Gideon. And so she doesn't remember Gideon, but kind of subconsciously must have some remnant of memory left because she calls out for Gideon. And this does prompt a very important thing to happen, but we don't learn about it until like hundreds and hundreds of pages later.
No. This little prologue is really fun to read after finishing the book, like going back and trying to fit it in logical order where it belongs. But anyway, we won't say much more about that chapter right now.
Oh, one other thing that just in regards to the timeline, I did find it interesting that it says the night before the Emperor's murder here in the prologue, because presumably the Emperor's murder happened just hours after this.
Yeah, but maybe it happened in the wee hours of the morning.
Yeah, maybe. I guess that's true. You make a good point. So we get the 3 syllables you don't even understand, and then we skip 14 months earlier back to the 9th house. So it's the Parados, and this says 14 months before the Emperor's murder. And this one has a broken, like a fractured 9th house skull decal. So we're back to 3rd person and sometime in the past. And it's pre-Canaan house, and Harrow is on the 9th house with her cavalier. And when you first read this, you're like, oh, Gideon. But no, it turns out that we're talking about Ortis here. And I think when I first read it, I was like, oh, this could have happened. Like, this is a memory of before Ortis escaped on Gideon's shuttle, and maybe Gideon's still around. But there is no mention of Gideon, and it's as if Gideon never existed. So...
That's true. This is also a chapter where we start to see the massive slams on Ortis Niganad out of nowhere that just happen throughout the whole book. He is also a very unlikable character, at least to me. I mean, and we're reading this from Harrow's perspective, and Harrow doesn't think much of Ortis, so it makes sense that we wouldn't either. But I had that impression that you did, Amy, until literally like the 3rd page of this chapter, when Ortis suggests, there's a very confusing paragraph where, and I think we've shared before that we both listened to these books before we read them. So it's kind of fun to read them and see how the different like typefaces change.
Mm-hmm. Ortis is reading the Emperor's letter to Harrow that's inviting both of them to try to obtain lictorhood at the 1st house, and Ortis is explaining that he's not up to the challenge. And then it gets very confusing.
Very confusing.
Ortis repeats the None of the Cavalier's virtue line twice, verbatim. You know what Tamsyn Muir does here that's really good? They're both obviously kind of confused. They're like living in this weird river play. And like, as we learn later, Ortis is kind of in and out. He sometimes remembers that this is fake and then sometimes is really in it. You get that feeling. You're like living in this alternate reality, and you don't remember like what's real and what's not. And things like repeating this line and have you ever considered Ortis Niganad, that line?
Yeah, that's the line I was referring to, where I feel like my brain broke when I read this chapter, where he says, you're supposed to replace Ortis Niganad with Gideon. And that's likely the conversation that Ortis and Harrow had in reality. But because of what Harrow's done to herself, and because she's trying to like form these memories to replace anything that used to have Gideon. And in the book, Ortis Niganad here is capitalized and bolded. And he says, if a cavalier's duty is to die by the sword, have you never considered Ortis Niganad? Which implies that he's talking in the 3rd person out loud. And Harrow's so confused, and Ortis just kind of keeps talking. And Harrow's like, have we had this conversation before? Like, what's going on?
We got another meme in here, too.
And we have a great meme. This is a good meme where Harrow's kind of just being an asshole to Ortis and is like, each time the news that you have not spent your life in acquiring martial virtues comes as a little less of a shock to me. But have a go. Surprise me. My body is ready, which doesn't sound like Harrow at all. It actually sounds like Ianthe to me, but I feel like Tamsyn Muir wrote this just so she could sneak in this meme.
I know.
And my body is ready comes from, I think, one of like the founder or the head of Nintendo back in the day when they were releasing the Wii, and he's in front of this big auditorium and talks about, you know, how the Wii works. He says, my body is ready, which was very weird. And then it got turned into a meme. Great meme. Great use of the meme here.
I like how we get just in this first couple of pages, we're getting like 4 or 5 memes.
It's so meme heavy. I couldn't believe it.
I will also say from the very beginning, although, you know, reading it or listening to it the first time, I was furious and so mad about everything. Tamsyn Muir's writing is, the first book is really well written, but I think she becomes a better writer in this book too. Like, it's really, really good.
Yep.
I think she gets a little bit more, it gets darker and lighter at the same time.
It almost gets so dark that she lightens it up with the memes. It's almost like she knew how dark it was. And after having a character like Gideon, who's so lovely and funny, and then having to go to this really dark place where she knows she's killed off everyone's favorite character, and Harrow's not Gideon, and it takes you a while to warm to Harrow, I feel like she was like, I gotta give these people some comic relief until they get hooked.
Yeah. And give herself some comic relief. I'm sure this was not an easy book to write.
No.
So we also start to learn a little bit more about Ortis's obsession with the Matthias Nonius and his book, The Noniad, of which I think there are like, 14 volumes or something ridiculous. Mm-hmm. So Ortis is talking about, he's quoting the Noniad, and then Harrow sees a Serbian sister arrive, and that's fine, but it is wearing the face of the body in the tomb, which is Alecto.
Yes.
Do we already know this?
I don't think we fully know.
We don't know this. We wouldn't have known this, but we now know that Alecto, God's cavalier, but, you know, God would say his bodyguard, is the body in the tomb. And that's who Harrow fell in love with, and who appears both in the real world and in these weird river bubble dreams. And the Serbian sister with Alecto's face turns to Harrow and says, "This isn't how it happens," which is going to be repeated over and over again in this book. I feel like I kept, when I listened to this the first time, I would hear this line, "This isn't how it happens," even though it's quite obviously stated. I should have understood as soon as we heard this line the first time that this is an alternate reality that didn't actually happen. It took me a long time to realize that it was an alternate reality that didn't actually happen.
Totally. I actually thought that all of Gideon was fake, which added to my fury.
Too.
And I was like,
so
wait,
confused.
was that all a dream? Why did we even read it?
Yeah. Hard same. I was so confused, at least for the first half of the book. One more thing to say about this chapter is at the very end, Harrow tells Ortis that she is insane and that Ortis needs to help her hide this infirmity at Canaan House. So we get our first, "You see, I am insane," which will come back again as well. So I think in all of these realities that Harrow believes that she is insane and, seeing things that aren't there.
Right.
So then we get to chapter 1.
We get to Act 1, Chapter 1.
Act 1, Chapter 1. 9 months before the Emperor's murder. And we're back to second person here. So basically, anytime we're in second person, we're kind of in the present. In real life, this is actually happening. This is not a river projection. And it starts with Harrow tries to pick up the longsword, which we know to be Gideon's, but she's somehow forgotten this information, and she vomits every time she tries to wield it. She also, this is the first time I think that we see that she really feels like it hates her.
She talks about that in Gideon, but we see it even more strongly here. Also a note just on how trauma lives in the body. And that is kind of a theme that keeps happening throughout this entire book, is that even though Harrow has done all she can to erase Gideon from her mind, clearly Harrow's body knows about Gideon and continues to have reactions to things that could remind Harrow of Gideon. And so Harrow vomiting over and over again every time she tries to wield this sword is just further evidence of what Harrow's done to herself.
Yeah. Yeah. Have we said yet that this book is a book about trauma?
I don't think we've actually said that. Trauma and grief.
This is a book about, trauma and grief.
Oh, yeah.
Depression and dysmorphia and like all sorts of pretty dark shit.
It's dark. Yeah.
Yeah, Harrow is definitely in a state of shock and deep trauma. We see so much how all of Harrow's behaviors and neuroses are a response to the trauma she's basically experienced her whole life. Her trying to control her environment, which for her whole life has been difficult to control. There are a lot of really good lines, too, that really resonated with me in this book. And I think the first one is here. So Harrow, she paints her face with her own blood because there's no paint and she feels sort of naked without her face paint. And after that, there's this really good line that says, sometimes you would forget who you were and at recalling yourself, weep like a child. And that is like some... Yeah, Harrow is going through it.
It is, again, to reiterate, really shocking to read Harrow in this moment because we're so used to seeing Harrow as really confident and sure of herself through Gideon's eyes. Kind of this like infallible, I mean, not infallible in that Harrow also it was like a huge asshole, but just as kind of like a superhuman genius person. And then we very quickly get thrown into this part of Harrow, and it is very hard. It was very hard for me as a reader to figure out how to reconcile the Harrow that we knew before with this Harrow.
Yeah, and you see how much Harrow must have been going through the whole time at Canaan House that we just never saw.
Yeah.
And as much as I think Gideon is a really good person who does see the good in people, I think Gideon did have a hard time seeing Harrow as human and was ready to see Harrow as human, but Harrow didn't really give her much of a chance to experience Harrow's humanity.
No.
But here we are all of a sudden, we're like, wow, Harrow is a human and a deeply traumatized human with massive shock going on.
Right. And similarly with the face paint and the continued theme of Harrow covering up her face is like always trying to hide behind that. And I think we see, and we'll talk about it in a couple chapters, just kind of what the face paint represents to her and how it really does hide her pain from the rest, from everyone around her. And is used in very pointedly in that way.
Right. We also see a lot about Harrow's relationship to the sword in this chapter. It's a short little chapter, but basically it's all about Harrow and the sword and how it's making her have these very negative physical reactions, but she's also very attached to it. It's implied that someone tried to take the sword from her at some point and she might have killed them. I think Ianthe later says that your only states were power, vomit, and murder. So it sounds like, that Harrow probably killed someone who tried to take the sword from her, probably just to try and help her out.
Yeah.
And Harrow's not doing well. And then we get to chapter 2, still in second person, with God visiting Harrow in her room.
That asshole.
I know. God really does suck. Although I will say, so we get our first mention of the Saint of Joy, Mercy Morn, who apparently has been trying to contact God. And God tells one of the attendants to station the first person or the last person to have graduated from Trentum, which is like their military training school, to get on the intercom basically and make static noises so that Mercy Morn thinks that she isn't getting through to the spaceship that they're on, which is very funny.
It's very funny, and it's great for character development of God, right? We just see how much of a doofus he is, like, throughout the whole book, in addition to being, like, very manipulative, obviously very smart, but also just kind of a shit. And this is one of the first funny parts that we see of him there.
Yeah, he's interesting. I've been thinking a lot about God, and I feel like I don't really like him as a character. And it is interesting to me to think about what his motivations are and like who he actually is underneath this 10,000-year-old facade. Because he's definitely trying to give you nice dad vibes, but he does seem really manipulative. And I do think that he definitely thinks that this whole world is about him.
Well, he is God.
Yeah, and that he is kind of delusional, and maybe not though, but he does literally keep everyone alive. But yeah, he thinks the story revolves around him, and he doesn't understand that actually it's starting to revolve around other people instead. Mm-hmm. So
it should be noted that, and I think it was maybe in chapter 1 or even in the prologue, where Harrow hears kind of drum beats, like wet drum beats, mm-hmm. and realizes that they're hearts beating. And there are a lot of them, I think hundreds. And some of them don't all beat the same. And we learn that there's a difference in the way that a necromancer's heart beats and someone who's not a necromancer. And it's in this chapter that we learn who all those people are. And this, I've got questions about this. But basically, God brings Harrow to this room that has a ton of coffins in it.
Oh, also we should say the body is with Harrow. So Harrow keeps on seeing throughout this book, Harrow keeps on seeing the body of Alecto, the person in the tomb who she fell in love with when she was 11 or something. And throughout much of this book, until the very end, the body is often present. And there's also a little moment here where Harrow's looking at the body in the mirror, and it looks like God can see the body too, but it was sort of a trick of the light or something, I think she says. But I do wonder actually if God can see the body.
I don't think God can see the body right now. And I say that only because spoiler alert, way later in the book when Harrow says to God, I open the tomb, God genuinely does not believe her.
Yeah, I was thinking more like that God for 10,000 years had been seeing this sort of ghost of his cavalier and just at this point kind of dismisses it. Mm. It's just something in the background, but actually he can.
Maybe.
But I don't know.
That would be cool.
I just thought it was interesting that we got this little, Harrow thinks that God can see the body. It seemed like a weird thing to throw in there for no reason.
Yeah. There's a lot in this chapter that we learn about Harrow and the body.
Right.
Which kind of happens after this really weird and freaky thing where God leads Harrow to the cargo bay and shows her these resurrected people that he's shipping off to the Ninth House to restore it. Mm-hmm. And it's very very strange because Harrow's like, oh, well, you resurrected these people. And God explains that these people are actually leftover people that he, quote unquote, saved from the original resurrection, which blows my mind, and I don't fully understand. I mean, God could have restored the Ninth House a long time ago. And this one really grinds my gears. I'm like, you had all these spare people, and Harrow's like breaking her back over just trying to keep this house alive and struggling. And yet this whole time you had more people that you could have sent, to the Ninth House. And it's just this part of how manipulative God is here. But basically, as a reward for Harrow becoming a lictor, he's restoring the Ninth House with these extra bodies that he has lying around. And it's just very odd to me.
It is also interesting to me because it implies that, and I think that this is also implied later in the book in a conversation between God and Augustine, that God resurrected people after sort of the apocalypse but did not resurrect their memories. So he resurrected all these people with presumably no memory of their past self. Obviously, these people who were living in year 2150 are not going to have memories of being from what we would see as, not too far in the future.
Totally. I need to see how this works. I want a short story that follows one of these people who goes to the Ninth. Can you imagine you've been dead for 10,000 years or you haven't existed, and then all of a sudden you exist as a full 14-year-old on the Ninth House? I mean, What is that experience? That cannot be good.
So wild. And even people like, I remember God says to Augustine says, like, we should just give up on this weird vendetta that we have against people who left Earth to die. And God is like, if the man you were before the resurrection could hear you say that, he would, be pissed. And Augustine's like, yeah, thanks for confirming that. So it kind of implies that Augustine doesn't even remember who he was, which is wild.
That is weird.
So all these people wake up at age 35 and have no memories.
Just a very bizarre situation.
Mm-hmm. Harrow also sees all the coffins that contain the dead from Canaan House, and then some of them that do not contain the dead because
they ain't dead.
Yeah.
They ain't dead. And so there's a third house coffin with no one there. There is a sixth house coffin with just some scraps, which we know what those scraps are. Very sad. And no coffins for the Cavaliers. Did you notice that?
Yeah. Well, no coffins for the Cavaliers. Right, yeah.
Camilla Hecht doesn't have a coffin here. And the coffin for the third is presumably Coronabeth's, not Nibirius's. And
he does say that he was going to tell the houses that the Cavaliers had joined their lictors.
Their necromancers.
Or their necromancers, yeah, in lictorhood.
It's just kind of like fucked up. I don't know.
Yeah, and he's like, one of the dubious privileges of the first house is not having to explain yourself. And I'm like, you are on such an ego trip.
Yep.
And then Harrow has this really interesting reaction. Harrow's like, why can't you resurrect people? I feel like a lot of Harrow's, as you were saying, her body has these reactions to things that her mind doesn't really understand. And Harrow falls to her knees on this grate on the floor and begs God basically to teach her how to resurrect people. I think not even really understanding why she wants that so badly, because she doesn't remember Gideon. Mm-hmm. And God doesn't oblige, obviously.
No. He doesn't oblige, and the way that he doesn't oblige is by giving this very patronizing biochemistry lesson on planetary revenants and resurrection beasts, and he does it through inquiry. And I find the structure of this really good because it just kind of shows how patronizing this guy is, but also is a helpful structure to help the reader understand what these things are. And it's explained really well. And I think Tamsyn does a really good job explaining this pretty complicated process.
She's so good at this where she doesn't over-explain.
No.
But she does make it sound totally plausible.
No, and it's really actually quite a simple thing, but Tamsyn uses kind of complicated vocabulary that I have to Google because it's biochemistry. And I remember when I read this again for like the millionth time, I had a question and then in the next paragraph it was answered. So just really well done. But basically, God is asking Harrow, I think the first question that he asks
her what happens when you die, and Harrow basically says you enter the river, and if it's a normal,
what happens to the soul?
What happens to the soul? Yeah, the soul enters the river. But if it's a shock death, like a murder or a sudden violent death, that often the shock of the death is enough to keep the soul out of the river long enough for it to basically become a ghost and inhabit a physical shell.
Right.
And that's a revenant.
That's a revenant. And Tamsyn uses literal biochemistry language to describe this, and it's very sound. I'm just saying, like, no holes in this at all. Basically,
osmotic pressure,
liminal osmosis and osmotic pressure. And I Googled all these things in preparation because I was like, I should just know. And we don't have to go into it. All I'm saying is that it tracks. She basically uses what is actually osmosis in our universe and just applies it to the soul in this universe. And it's really
major biochem flashbacks.
Really well done. And I think the other thing is that I think God asks, who has a soul? Or what has a soul? And Harrow says, well, anything with a thalergetic complexity significant enough to have a soul. So humanity. And then God's like stretch your mind a little bit. What else?
This is also where we get a little, it's not a meme, but a really interesting and illuminating quote.
Yeah, why don't you go through that?
God says in response to Harrow's answer to his question, "Why have we not an immortal soul? I would give gladly all the hundreds of years that I have to live to be a human being for just one day." And that's from The Little Mermaid, like the OG story. And it's interesting because someone pointed out on Reddit, I read this once, I think the user is AltACC 2020. And then it's also on this Harrow the Ninth gloss blog post by Jen Jenny, just to shout out my sources. But this part of The Little Mermaid also continues on. It's The Little Mermaid talking to her grandma about how badly she wants to live in the human world. And her grandma's explaining that the only way that she could do it is by marrying a human person. And says, "Then his soul would glide into your body and you would obtain a share in the future happiness of mankind."
Wow.
He would give a soul to you and retain his own as well.
Oh my God.
Which is like, this is like a, I don't know what we really learned from this, but it is really interesting that just talking about Alecto as the saltwater creature and the Edgar Allan Poe poem that we read later in the book, there's so much symbolism pulled from so many different sources that make up this mythology. It's mind-blowing.
What we learn is that Tamsyn Muir is a fucking genius and very well read. I think that's I mean, it's amazing.
She's so smart.
Wow. We could just spend the rest of this episode fangirling Tamsyn Muir because she's so amazing. But anyway, the point, we'll speed up on on what makes a resurrection beast. But basically, you know, God's trying to get Harrow to see that another really complex massive thalargy is also in the form of a planet. And Harrow's like, well, what are you talking about? You can't possibly call a planet one coherent system, which was my question. And then God right away is like, well, all a human is a bunch of different systems together too. And it begs the question of what is a human and what is a planet, and here where they become more equated. But essentially, when you kill a planet very suddenly, you create this resurrection beast. Mm-hmm. And so in the typical way that the houses kill off other or the cohort kills planets is gradually. So the cohort goes in, they start the process, and then the necromancer comes in and finishes it out, and then the planet dies really slowly. Mm-hmm. But in the case of the resurrection, all the planets in this system were killed very fast, all at once, and that created 9 resurrection beasts. And the interesting thing that we learn here is that God explains that they've killed 5 and now there are 3, which for those math wizards out there, you will know that 5 plus 3 does not equal 9. And so there's a question here around who is the other resurrection beast. And I think we know for the most part that this is Alecto.
Right. And even here, I think when Harrow's like, how many resurrection beasts are there? And John says there are 3. Alecto, the body, raises her eyebrows.
Right. But you think when you first read this that she's raising her eyebrows because it's so few. But what the eyebrow raise here is really,
I'm right here.
You're not going to count me in that?
Yeah. I think it's pretty clear that Alecto is one of the resurrection beasts and contains basically all of the thalargy of Earth.
Right.
So
that is our assumption. I will add one thing here in this conversation that I think is interesting and also part of the worldview of all the people who are culturally part of these 9 houses, which is that when talking about how the cohort prepares the planet and then it's dying slowly, Harrow says this is a long-term process. It takes generations and you can't quantify it as something happening, which is kind of is like a super ignorant worldview around the impact that these necromancers and this life is having on living beings, because she's essentially saying it's totally fine to kill a planet slowly. It happens over generations and then you resettle people. And what we learn in Nona is that Well, and also just from BOE and their whole existence. This is really not okay. This is not okay with people. But this comment that Harrow makes really is just part of kind of the worldview of this whole society.
Right. And it really mirrors, I think, some people's views on colonialism. Like, we're going in and changing some things, but it's not, we're appending the whole culture all at once. A slow destruction of something is still a destruction of something.
Totally.
So,
right.
And God explains to Harrow that because of this, and because for some reason the resurrection beasts are constantly trying to destroy God and all of his lictors because of the sin they committed when they killed their cavaliers, that Harrow can never go home because she would lead a resurrection beast to the ninth house, which she obviously doesn't want to do. And he says, you can go off, not join me, but you can't go home. But if you do join me, we can try and defeat these resurrection beasts together. And the body says to Harrow, what this means is that you have to learn how to use this sword. And what we learn in this moment is that the body has actually it's been there in projection or whatever since Harrow entered the tomb, but it hasn't talked to her since the day her parents died. And also that it used to have black eyes, but now the body has yellow eyes.
I forgot about this, and then when I read it, I'm very confused about this because now we know that John's eyes are Alecto's eyes, but Alecto, up until this point, has also had her eyes. Alecto's eyes have been black, John's eyes have been black. The gold eyes that Gideon has are actually John's eyes. And so my question here is, are we assuming that the body's eyes turning yellow is because she has Gideon's eyes, or because of her connection to God and something has changed and she now has his eyes?
I took it as there are a lot of times in this book where the body interacts with Harrow in a way that makes me think that the body is partially Gideon now, or at least takes on some of the characteristics of Gideon. There are points where the way that they interact is very much like the way Harrow would interact with Gideon. I can explain more what I'm thinking when we get to these parts, but I do think that this is more about the fact that Gideon is also in Harrow now, and that the body is now this amalgamation of whatever it means that Harrow sees the body all the time, but also that Gideon is like in the back of her mind as well. It's like
hot take.
Yeah.
Hot take.
There's also this bit at the end where Harrow's like, what are my eyes like? Did they change? And the body says, she told me not to tell you. Implying that there is at least some communication between the body and Gideon.
Right.
And it may not be talking, but some sort of understanding between them.
Right. Right.
And again, the body says, you're walking down a long passage. You need to turn around. What does this mean? Is that figurative?
Well, this one is interesting because they have this conversation. You're walking down a long passage. You need to turn around. And then Harrow out loud says, I am standing in the dark.
Oh, yeah.
I lost it. It's gone. There's nothing there. I must have misapprehended the process. I am half a lictor. I am nothing. I am pointless. I am unmanned. And God thinks that she's just talking out loud to him. But I think this is partially about when Harrow says, I lost it, it's gone. I want this to mean she's lost Gideon's soul. It's gone. Like she can't access it. There's nothing there. I don't know that she knows she's talking about Gideon's soul. She might think that she means Ortis's at this point. And God interprets this to mean that Harrow thinks that Gideon died for no reason. They were wasted because Harrow didn't finish the process.
Yeah, and this is where God says, Ortis Niganad did not die for nothing. But actually what he said is Gideon Nav did not die for nothing, but Harrow hears it. And for the rest of the book, Harrow will hear Gideon Nav as Ortis Niganad anytime anyone mentions Gideon.
And we see that clue because every time there's some indication in Harrow's body that she's actually hearing Gideon, right? She starts to bleed. She gets a headache. There's all sorts of things. And here even God's mouth looks weird because he's really saying Gideon, but she's hearing Ortis.
Right.
And that continues to pop up throughout the book too.
Yeah. So a huge chapter, many revelations, nothing makes sense still. And then we go to chapter 3, which is kind of a weird chapter. We're back to third person, and it's just a chapter explaining Harrow's childhood and her path to meeting and falling in love with the body. I feel like Harrow makes a lot more sense after this chapter.
Yeah.
Basically, we learn that she knew, as soon as she could comprehend it, that she was the product of this genocide and started her down this road of complete self-hate. But also that she was very studious and self-driven and kind of hid her trauma and guilt that she felt in study to try and sort of make herself worth it.
Yeah, I think the main takeaways from this chapter are just we learn how dark Harrow's childhood was.
Right.
And her motivations for why she wanted to become a lictor, which is essentially to revitalize her house and to make her life worth living because she is the result of this genocide. There's one little funny line in here where this poem that her aunts sing her say to her.
Funny and so sad.
It's so sad. It's devastating, really. But the tomb I will serve till the end of my days and then see me buried in 200 graves. And it's, which they thought sweetly whimsical, just right for a little girl. And it just, what we're seeing is that Harrow is surrounded by people who feel really shitty about what they did, felt like they had to do it, and then are never the same after. So Harrow never experienced the parts of her parents that existed before this genocide.
Yeah.
I think what strikes me in reading this chapter now is when Harrow tells God much later on that her family did this, and his reaction is kind of like, well, whatever. The difference between Harrow's parents and God is that Harrow's parents felt incredible remorse and were haunted by this decision that they made for their entire lives. And God doesn't seem to show any remorse. And so that is the difference here.
Yeah. And God even gets upset at the idea that people try and make Harrow feel bad for it because he's projecting.
Yeah. Yeah.
We get to learn a little bit about Harrow falling in love with the body in the tomb. Basically, it talks a lot about how Harrow divides her life into two parts, the part before she fell in love and the part after. I do get a little bit confused with the timeline because
Same.
It kind of makes it sound like the day that she got Gideon's blood on her hands, she opened the door, but then she was much older before she could actually enter the tomb.
Well, I reread this and then I was thinking about it because, and maybe this is actually a mistake in this chapter, but what Harrow says to Gideon when she's describing opening the tomb is that it took Harrow a really long time to figure out all the different wards and stuff. And then after that big fight that they got in where she had Gideon's blood under her fingernails,
right,
that was the day that she actually got through and met this body. But presumably she had been trying to get through and figuring everything out because there were more wards than just the blood ward.
Right.
So I was confused about at what this makes it sound like.
The blood ward was first.
Yes. And which maybe it was. I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe it's the blood ward is first and then there are a bunch of other wards and stuff and she gets through them and then but it also I sometimes forget that the Gideon Harrow fight that leaves Gideon's blood all over her hands and allows her to open the tomb is a full year plus before Gideon discovers that she's entered the tomb and tells her parents.
Right.
There's like a year.
Yes. Because it says she got lazy and let someone
her parents had found out.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then her parents, as we know, killed themselves with Harrow there. I mean, the amount of shit that this girl has gone through is truly hard to comprehend. And as soon as this happens, so as soon as her parents die, she falls in love at the same time and she starts to hear voices and she starts to believe that she's insane. This is when that all starts. And we see how Harrow really used the rituals of the ninth house to try and impose some order on what seemed to be this sort of chaotic insanity that she was experiencing.
Her coping mechanisms.
Which I think is a totally normal coping mechanism for
totally
deep emotional and mental distress.
We also see how Harrow's relationship with the body changes over the course of her life, and the role that the body played also in essentially supporting Harrow through this pretty horrible childhood. And interestingly, you know, when Harrow is going through puberty, the body stopped appearing when she was awake. But the other hallucinations kept on.
Right.
Which obviously made Harrow very upset.
Right.
That this body who has accompanied her is no longer there.
And we see that Harrow is basically holding her whole house together by herself from the age of whatever, 11, 10 or 11 when her parents die. And that this is just puts an immense amount of strain on her. And the only people who know are Crux and Iglamine and Gideon, but she's forgotten about Gideon in this moment. This is told from the perspective of Harrow having forgotten Gideon, because there's this amazing line at the very end of the chapter that says, there had been another girl who grew up alongside Harrow, but she had died before Harrow was born.
Oh my God.
What the hell?
I reread that so many times. I was like, I think my note here in my book is screaming. It's like, it's just like a really hard, yeah, anyway.
Yeah. All right, so we get that. That's a short little chapter explaining a lot more about Harrow. We've got a lot of this. The structure of this is so good. We get to chapter 4. We're back to second person, back to the present.
This is a big chapter.
Oh, yeah.
Y'all.
Ianthe comes onto the stage in full glory. But first, Harrow wakes up in the present being choked to death with her own pillow and breaks off pieces of her nails and shoots them forward to kill her attacker, and then immediately wakes up again with no sign of being attacked. This poor girl. This is constantly being caused to doubt her own reality.
Yeah, I do think that description of how Harrow overcomes being choked to death with her fingernail is so badass.
I know.
We don't need to go into the details of that, but it's badass.
Yes.
Who do you think is killing her? At first, you know, I read this and I'm like, oh, this is Gideon, but they're not on the Mithraeum yet. So Gideon's not here.
I think it's basically God ordered someone to do this to Harrow.
Why?
Because God also ordered Gideon Gideon the First to try and kill Harrow. I think God is basically, this is the first time that God is like, in order to try and get Harrow to become a full lictor, we're going to force her into it by trying to kill her.
I see.
And only by trying to kill her will she let that other side of her take over. At first I thought it was God or Ianthe, but I actually think it's just some random person who God commanded to do this to Harrow. And, you know, it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. Thank Goddess.
Yes.
And we see Ianthe just sitting by Harrow's bed.
Right. Harrow wakes up again. It's almost as if it was a bad dream. Harrow wakes up again, Ianthe sitting by her bed, which is another type of bad dream.
Or a great dream. God, Ianthe is just such a good character. Not a good person, great character.
So Tamsyn Muir based Ianthe off of this trope in fan fiction, which is the Draco in leather pants, which is this sexy Draco figure who's always sitting in the corner making witty comments. And that is also like kind of sexualized, often as like flirting with Harry Potter. And Tamsyn Muir said in an interview that she wanted to have this trope but flipped, because it's always this dude. And so she wanted Ianthe to play this sort of sexy, I don't give a shit character who's always just kind of there.
Well, success.
Yeah. And this is the first time we really, besides that first chapter, but really this is the first time we get to see Ianthe in her full glory. And she's just glowing and like talking to Harrow like they're BFF. And Harrow's like, what the fuck?
It is a major what the fuck moment for Harrow and for me. Mm-hmm. It's like the level of familiarity with which Ianthe is acting towards Harrow is just so shocking and upsetting. Yeah, what the fuck? But we know that Harrow is surprised by Ianthe's presence because Ianthe is a lictor and Harrow cannot sense her.
Right.
There's a line here that says, the brain, you knew grudgingly, existed. The heart was an open question, which is just funny.
Yes, it is. Ianthe gives her a letter, which seems to be written by Harrow to herself. So Harrow reads this letter, and it is, in fact, written by a Harrow claiming to be dead. So a previous version of herself. It's funny to me that Harrow just, I mean, it says she would rather blindly follow these precepts than go insane. So she just kind of blindly accepts this letter.
I mean, it's written in a code that only Harrow could know. And so I think there's some level of trust that this was her previous self. I don't know about you, but when these letters came up in this chapter, I felt so relieved. In reading the old version of Harrow, I just felt like, okay, there's the Harrow that I'm familiar with, and it gave me a little bit more trust in the book after reading them.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I do think it makes sense why she would think it was in fact written by her. But even though it's written by her, she's completely okay with letting this previous version of herself tell her what to do. It's just she so wants someone to tell her what to do because she's so screwed up. Mm-hmm. I also thought, so this letter has guidelines for living the rest of her life. They're very funny, or some of them are funny. But I was mostly interested in guideline number 3, which is giving her instructions for the longsword. She says to bathe it in her own blood and cover it with this sort of bone scabbard, which makes me feel like Harrow at least sort of knew that previous Harrow, pre-lobotomy Harrow, knew that there was a revenant in the sword.
That's so interesting because my read on that is that she's keeping it because it was very important to Gideon, and should Gideon ever come back, she wanted to make sure that Gideon had her longsword.
Yeah, but I do think it says, like, do not pierce flesh with it, which is a weird thing to say unless you knew that it was a revenant that could be passed on to another body.
Yeah, that's true. Odd. Very odd.
She must have had some idea.
I love this threat by Harrow to Harrow in the first part of the letter where she writes, break troth with me, and from beyond my destruction I will brand you tomb heretic, cut off utterly from that which lies in the frozen altar, asleep and dead, removed from the adoration thereof, and any promise of part in her resurrection. She's like threatening herself.
I know.
It's so good.
It is. It's very old Harrow, and it's very refreshing and encouraging to read.
I think guideline number 4 is also interesting because the guideline number 4 is that you are compromised, which I guess could just mean that she lobotomized herself and that she had Ianthe do it, and so therefore that's what it means. But it could mean, if we're going with the theory that she knew that Wake, or that there was a revenant in the sword that was haunting her, if she did know that, that's what this could also refer to. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, this guideline number 5, which is so funny. You owe Ianthe Tridentarius the favor of the chain, which is just like, has to be the most infuriating thing that has ever happened to Harrow, which is you owe Ianthe your life. Can you even, I can't. But here she writes, you're in her power, and I am in no doubt of her misusing it. You yourself never had power over anyone else, but you misused it violently.
Ugh.
Ooh.
It's so good. Brutal. And then, continuing this freaking Ianthe party, it says that she has to check Ianthe's jaw and tongue.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
Listen, I'm telling you, sometimes Tamsyn Muir was just like, I want these people to make out. How can I make that happen?
Yep. Totally. And it brilliantly done here.
I know. So Harrow puts down the letter and kisses Ianthe. I love that there are a couple of moments where, like, reading back through it, you're like, oh, of course this is Gideon talking. So Harrow kisses Ianthe. Right. And the narrator, who we know is Gideon, says, this, at least, she hadn't expected. How could she? What the fuck? Yeah.
Also, if you listen to the audiobook, whenever the second person comes up, Moira Quirk's voice is kind of Gideon.
Yes.
So it does allude to that.
Not so much that it's super obvious, but enough that if you
enough.
know.
If you know, you know. And basically, the reason why she needed to check her jaw and tongue and whatever is that Ianthe submitted to be made a sewn tongue in capital letters, which I think means that there is some sort of necromancy magic that prevents Ianthe from being able to say certain things.
Yes. Yes. So that's very surprising for Ianthe. Very funny for us. I like the point where Ianthe makes a high wounded noise and the narrator's like, she's probably asking for help. But we know that Ianthe's so into it. Ianthe fucking loves this.
Yes. Ianthe's all about it. And I do think by the end of the book, really has a thing for Harrow.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Who wouldn't have a thing for Harrow, honestly?
I know. I don't know why, but I think that I find Harrow attractive. I do.
I know why, but we don't have to go there.
And then there's another meme, sort of. Well, meme. It's a there's another reference. This one's a Casablanca reference, weirdly. Ianthe says, "What's more, now we are about to embark on what promises to be a truly beautiful friendship. With me, the lone fruitful thing in your salted field," etc., etc. And that's the beautiful friendship is obviously a reference to Casablanca. I also feel like the lone fruitful thing in your salted field sounds super biblical, but I don't know if it's actually, I don't remember any specific Bible verse that says that.
It sounds it. Also, before this, again, we get another reference to Harrow referencing her cavalier as Ortis Niganad. And Ianthe's like, who? Oh, yes, the cavalier. It's like, right. Ianthe, don't be a little asshole. You know, you agreed to this, and now you're making Harrow feel like she's crazy. But again, it's contributing to this continued theme where anytime Harrow says Ortis out loud, everyone looks like a little confused.
Yeah, or very confused. So when Ianthe hands her these 20 letters or whatever, Harrow reads some of the prompts for like when she would want to open them. And one of them says to open if you meet Camilla VI. And she says that she has no memory of interacting with Camilla VI. And this is the first point where I was kind of like, there's a memory loss situation going on.
Yes.
So.
Yes. And all the pieces, and we'll get there throughout the book, but you get more and more clues as to like what parts of Harrow's memory she chose to carve out and what she didn't. But yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So she has these 21 letters that she's supposed to open at different points. Prompts are written on the letters. There's also one that is not in a cipher that says, if you meet Coronabeth Tridentarius. And Ianthe explains that basically what this letter says is that Harrow was never allowed to harm Coronabeth. So that's interesting. And Harrow says, well, Coronabeth, your sister, is probably dead. And Ianthe's like, oh, no, she's not. She's honestly too stupid to die, which I thought was really funny. This relationship is not great.
It's weird.
And, Harrow asks for some time alone. I love that Ianthe's like, oh, how politely expressed. So Ianthe's heading out, and Harrow comments on the fact that her eyes keep changing and that she should have schooled Nibirius better. And Ianthe kind of stops and takes out her trident knife, or Nibirius's old trident knife, and stabs herself through the hand and pulls it out and immediately heals. And then goes over to Harrow and does the same thing and pulls it out, and Harrow does not immediately heal, which is a great demonstration both of Ianthe's extreme shittiness and also of the fact that Harrow is not a full lictor in the way that Ianthe is.
Which is just like a rude way of demonstrating that.
Yeah. For the reader, it's like, oh, so this is where we're at. Harrow is, has some of these powers but can't heal, which is like a huge part of being a lictor. And Ianthe leaves, and Harrow kind of crumples up against the wall. And as the last blow to Harrow in this chapter, she sees that the crates that are against this wall opposite her bed are actually, these crates are covering up bloody nail fragments that have been driven into the wall. confirming that her little weird smother dream at the beginning of the chapter actually did happen.
Dark.
Super dark.
I love that. I mean, overall, I will say chapter 4, A+. A++ chapter.
It's really, really good.
It's really strong. And again, Ianthe as a character just kind of blossoms here for us. And you kind of want more of her. At least I did. I was like, okay, this person sucks and is so funny. And again, part of the comic relief that we must have throughout this book, lest we go into just a deep, dark place ourselves.
Yeah. I love the second person bits, funny enough. And I remember when I first read this book, every time we'd switch back to the third person Canaan House Redux thing, I would be annoyed. But now I like both parts. But I do remember at the beginning, even though I was so reticent to read a book in second person, I didn't think it could be done well. Even though I'd read ones, you know.
N.K. Jemisin does it real well.
I know. So I don't know why I was such a hater.
A lot of people don't do it well. So, you know.
Anyway, I remember, for example, in this next chapter, chapter 5, we switch back to third person. And every time we switched back to third person and the Canaan House story, I would be annoyed.
Same. And I would actually zip through these chapters and be like, I just want to get this over with because this is stupid. I hate it. And like on the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh read, it's wonderful. But the first read, it's really hard. I will also say about second person that to me, the only way that second person can be done well is if there's a real purpose, a functional purpose for doing it. And in N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy, there is a real reason why and connection why she's using second person. And similarly here, second person is a key element of the plot of this book. And so I think where it really fails is when second person is used and you're like, there's no point. The author just kind of wanted to do this for funsies.
Right.
But here it really makes a difference.
It's really important because it kind of functions on two levels. The most obvious reason that it's written in second person is because it's Gideon narrating, you know, what is happening to Harrow, sort of back to her. But also it can be seen as like Harrow's also disassociating from herself. And it could have even worked, even if it didn't end up being Gideon narrating this. Harrow is unable to experience things. She's kind of viewing everything that's happening to her as another person looking down at herself.
Right. It could be her. It could have very well functioned as her narrating to herself once the two parts of herself like came back together. And I think that's why the mystery continues throughout this whole book, because while you really want it to be Gideon, it also might not be and could still have that other purpose. And so you don't know. And that duel, like that is, it's just so good.
I know. And I will say, I did not know that this was Gideon. I did not ruin this book for myself because I didn't know until the end. I didn't even get it. There were a couple of points where I should have gotten it and I just didn't. It like fully took until the end of the book.
For me, it was hoping.
Yeah.
I was so devastated by Gideon's death and by the fact that Tamsyn wrote Gideon out of Harrow that I had to believe that Gideon was still there. And so I didn't know. And then there were parts in the book where I was like, shit, it's not Gideon.
Yeah.
You know?
And then there are parts where it is Gideon now that I
know. It's so
I'm
obvious.
Like, obviously it's Gideon.
Yeah.
So chapter 5, we're back to third person. We've got the fractured ninth house skull, which I think indicates that this is the fake alternate reality that Harrow is creating. And Harrow is in the shuttle on the way to the first house with Ortis. The way that this structure works is often Harrow will fall asleep or pass out in the real world, and the next chapter will be a river bubble play.
Amy, we can't say real world. We have to say like the world outside the river.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. Everything is sort of real.
Yeah. It's like where they are is a real, it's like a dream in a real place, not outside the river or outside. Yeah, I don't know.
It reminds me of that bit in Harry Potter where Harry's like, is this real or is it taking place in my head? And Gandalf Dumbledore's oh man, I have read too much fantasy. Dumbledore's like, of course it's happening inside of your head, but why would that mean it's not real?
Yeah.
It's definitely like that kind of thing. So,
right.
Okay. So what I mean is, yes, this is taking place in the river, although it is real in its own way. And Harrow kind of comes to sort of discombobulated. She's yelling and Ortis is like, what can I do to calm you down? And she says, like, I thought she's confused and she's kind of like, where am I? And every time that she falls back into this river bubble, it takes her like a second to adjust, I feel like. Also, one thing I thought was interesting, Mel, because you pointed this out in Gideon, in this alternate reality, Harrow is sitting on the placket of house dirt. Like, she does take the placebo. Remember?
Oh my God. Wow. Good catch.
And I feel like that's really, it says a lot about how Harrow is feeling about herself in this alternate reality, and also how much I think Harrow hated to show weakness in front of Gideon. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't think Gideon realized how much Harrow being a hard ass was about proving to Gideon that she was a hard ass.
Totally. So, wow. Nice catch.
We got Ortis quoting the Noniad, which I have to look it up. It is it's written in some. It's not. It's like the structure.
Isn't it written in enneameter, which means 9 anyway.
Yeah, which I think is so funny. The amount of time that Tamsyn Muir must have put into just writing these little sections of the Noniad. Mm-hmm. What a gift to us all. Ortis quotes this bit of the Noniad in which he says something about a bone frenzy. Harrow is making fun of him for that, and Ortis is saying that anyone who would read it as a sexual thing would be, you know, a dumbass who would be more likely to read pornographic magazines. And I think he's kind of thinking of Gideon.
Definitely.
Does Ortis know what's going on here? This is my question.
I don't think he fully knows here.
He says, at least now I'll have time to finish it, which I think there are moments in, and we learn later that there were times where Ortis would remember and then he would forget again. And so I do think that there are little moments where Ortis is like, wow, I'm already dead. This is happening in this sort of alternate reality. And then other moments where he's fully in it.
Yeah. And it's also interesting because we get this little philosophical back and forth between him and Harrow about time. And he, I think, calls it the tragedy of time. And Harrow's like, what's so tragic about time? And Ortis is like, you're 17, you wouldn't understand. Mm-hmm. Basically, I mean, he doesn't say that, but that's like what he means. But he's asking if time is a tragedy to lictors, just to be alive forever. And part of me also wonders if he does know what's going on, this mirrors. It's like when you die, you're also still kind of alive in the river forever, and that's gotta fuck you up.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and we get more into that when Abigail talks about crossing the river and the sort of land beyond. So, yes. And there is this funny response when Ortis is really annoying Harrow, and Harrow wishes that she'd taken Iglamine. Maybe it would have been like a wild and confident fuck you to the rest of the houses to be like, I'm bringing this old person, and how cute that you still have traditional cavaliers that fight, LOL. But then says that she had to admit that the Ninth House character was low on wild and confident fucks. At least she knows. And then finally at the end of this chapter, we get our first of a thing that happens many times. So Harrow picks up a piece of paper, and on it...
Not paper. Oh, is it paper?
Or flimsy.
Is it paper or flimsy, actually? Maybe it's paper because it's Wake. I don't know.
Anyway, she picks up this piece of flimsy or whatever, and it says, "The eggs you gave me all died, and you lied to me."
Fucking so... Like just confusing when you read that. You're like, what the fuck? I remember reading this and being like, the eggs. Like, I was picturing scrambled eggs, and I like just didn't understand. You're not supposed to, but now we know.
Yeah, and Harrow hands this piece of flimsy over to Ortis, and Ortis is like, it's blank. And Harrow's like, fuck. Because she thinks that she's insane, but actually she's being haunted by... Okay, this is Harrow's situation. Harrow is being haunted by Wake, sort of semi-haunted by Alecto, and also has Gideon inside of her.
She's got a lot of people in her.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what this note means is it's actually a note from Wake to Augustine and Mercy Morn saying that the eggs that they had artificially inseminated with God's sperm that they were going to use to create a baby and then murder the baby to defeat the blood ward at the tomb.
Right.
That was like what they were intending. But those eggs died. And we know now that Wake impregnated herself with God's sperm and had Gideon. But that's what these eggs are that are written about in this note. And this note is written to Mercy Morn and Augustine, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think this is the first hint that we have that Wake is kind of just starting to take over this river bubble. So
yeah, and I was kind of confused just functionally. These notes are part of Wake's memory that is in Harrow.
I think that Wake's soul, the part of Wake's soul that is in Harrow and in the sword, is just this is just like a manifestation of her anger in this bubble. I don't think it's necessarily something that she actually wrote out at some point. But I think it is her soul trying to communicate with these people who she is so angry at.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's coming out as these weird messages that only Harrow can read.
Right. I did have one more thing I wanted to share just about, because the Erebus doesn't come up, I think, for the rest of the book. And that's the ship that they're all on right now before they head to the Mithraeum. And I was doing some research, and I'm pretty sure that Erebus, the ship in this book, is inspired by Erebus, who is the god of darkness in Greek mythology. And is described as the personification of darkness. And Erebus was the son of chaos, and also thought of as the god of the underworld, or a place of darkness between Earth and Hades. Also, I think in later Greek texts, Erebus is a region of the Greek underworld where the dead pass immediately after dying, which I just think is, obviously not a coincidence here. And just very smart naming of these ships. And I imagine that a lot of the other ships will find similar kind of references. But yeah, fun little fact there.
Cool. That is a good catch. Well, we should wrap that up here. We are definitely past the hour mark. Oops. As always, please like or review us wherever you get your podcasts. We are actually thinking about doing a question episode instead of just doing questions at the end of these episodes, because honestly, we've got a lot to cover in Harrow. So in order to keep these episodes manageable, we might do a couple of question episodes in between our Harrow reread episodes. So send us questions on Twitter or at our website, locktoompod.com, and we will love to answer them when we have one of those episodes. Okay,
Anyway, thanks y'all for listening. Please write us, review us. We'll see you hopefully
next week. We'll see. I'm Amy.
I'm Mel.
And we'll see you next time on the Locktoon Podcast.